Okay, let's start our bone histology lecture. So starting Unit 4. And you should have read the Unit 4 PowerPoints before starting these videos. If not, go back, read those PowerPoints so you have a background, and then we'll go over them. So this is just my representation of a typical bone. This is your femur, which you'll get to learn in lab soon enough. And we're going to go over the different parts that you'll find in the bone. And when you think of bone, you typically think of what you see on the outside of the bone, just this hard, smooth structure. It appears very fixed, or when you look at a skeleton, you just think that just is a very solid structure. But there's actually a lot going on inside the bone. It's always changing, always adapting to what's going on in terms of physical stress in your body, meaning exercise, weight-bearing exercise, just tension and pressure put on the bones, as well as internal environmental conditions like how much nutrients you're having or not having, all sorts of things. So the bone is constantly adapting to whatever is going on, both inside and outside of the body. But just generally, when we look at the outside of the bone, and it's that kind of whitish, hard, smooth stuff, that is what I've drawn here is that orange line. That's called compact bone. It's very compact, just like the name says. It's very dense, it's very tough, it's very hard, and it's hard because of calcium, and we'll see why that is in a little bit. But this will just be the very thin outer shell of the bone. It's not going to be super thick, because if it was, then your bones would be really, really heavy, and it would be really hard to move around. You would be much, much heavier if you had thicker, compact bone. So it's just a kind of thin, protective outer shell around the bone. Now on either side of the compact bone, we're going to have membranes. We have this green line here, that's the membrane inside the compact bone, and then this bluish purple line out here, and that's the membrane on the outside of the bone. So we would have seen this already a bit in Unit 2, where we were talking about the membranes that line outside of, that's not working, I'm trying to slide this up and it's going the other way, where we talk about the membranes that line both cartilage and bone, where we have something that's on the outside, and peri refers to what's on the outside. When you see peri, it means like the perimeter around the outside of something. When you see EUM or IUM, we're talking about a membrane. And then when you see osteo, or just right here, the partial part of the word, that we're talking about bone. So the periosteum is the membrane that surrounds the entire bone. If we were talking about cartilage, remember from before, that would be called the perichondrium. So there, the root word, chondro for cartilage. But here we're talking about the periosteum. This has a fibrous outer layer, so there'll be little connective tissue fibers sticking out all around. Some of them will extend into the compact bone, sort of being anchored into the compact bone to keep the periosteum really firmly secure. And then the periosteum is also going to be continuous with tendons and ligaments that attach to the bone. Tendons attach muscles to your bone, ligaments attach bones to other bones. And if you have the periosteum connected to those, it makes those attachments very strong and difficult to tear, which is a good thing. Now just deep to that, so right on top of the surface of the compact bone, you'll find a cellular inner layer. Here's where we'll find different bone cell types, which we're going to get to know in our next lecture. Osteoprogenitors, these are the stem cells. So they make new bone cells. Osteoclasts are responsible for breaking down bone, or something called osteolysis. So they break down bone matrix. And then we have osteoblasts, and anytime you see a blast cell, it's going to build bone, and building bone would be called osteogenesis. Okay, so osteoprogenitors are the stem cells that end up actually making osteoblasts, which will then go into the mature bone cell type, which build bone matrix, so doing osteogenesis, building up how much bone you have. And then the osteoclasts are responsible for doing osteolysis. And we're going to look at each of these cell types in our next lecture more specifically. But it's good to just notice here that you have some cells that are building bone and you have some cells that are breaking it down. And that's just to react to the varying environmental conditions. You don't want to just build bone, although you do want to build bone. You don't want to not build bone, but you don't want to build too much bone. It's all about that negative feedback thing. You want to build the right amount of bone, you don't want to build too much bone. So you need to have a nice little balance there. And that's what's going on in the periosteum. Now the endosteum is the membrane that lines inside the compact bone. So it's in contact with the very inside of the bone, which is called the marrow cavity, which everybody's heard of. And you're going to find those same cell types. So if you're seeing a pattern here, you're seeing these cells that are just kind of all stuck to the outside of the compact bone. So that's where all the action's going to be happening, is right on the interface between these membranes and the compact bone, as well as little blood vessels that are, or canals for blood vessels that will be kind of traversing throughout that compact bone. So you'll find those cells lining those as well. So all on the edges of the compact bone, you're going to find these cells that are building and taking away, adding and removing bone matrix. Okay, so that is the membranes, the periosteum and the endosteum. Endo means inside, osteo for bone, eum for membrane. And they're essentially sandwiching the compact bone. Now, once we get inside here, the marrow cavity, I think a lot of people, when you think of a marrow cavity, you think it's just like the really small inner core of a bone, but it's actually, most of the bone is filled up with this marrow cavity. And it's everything inside the endosteum, or deep to the endosteum, and it is filled completely with spongy bone, which can also be called cancellous bone. This looks exactly like a sponge, which is why I drew the little hash marks that way. It's like that so that you can have little spaces in between. We're going to fill it with different types of cells, which we'll see in a minute. But these little spaces are essentially not just going to be a place for other types of tissue to inhabit, but also it helps to make this much, much lighter so you don't have a super, super heavy bone. Okay, so now backing away from histology and just looking at the areas of the bone. So if you just look at any kind of long bone, like the femur, you can name the different parts of the bone. The ends are called the epiphyses. The end closest to the body is called the proximal epiphysis, because proximal means closer to the core, closer to the point of attachment, closer to the body. And the distal epiphysis is the one farther away from the body. So in this case, with the femur, the proximal epiphysis is what's going in to form your hip joint, and the distal epiphysis is contributing to your knee. Now the shaft of the bone is called the diaphysis, and there's a line here, not normally actually visible, but occasionally it is visible on an actual person. And this is called the epiphyseal line, excuse me, or the metaphysis. This is where you had once, when you were a child and still growing, you had a growth plate. And that growth plate is made of cartilage, and that cartilage would grow, and the bone would grow into it, kind of chasing it. And that would continue on throughout childhood until eventually the bone overtakes the cartilage and closes it, and you just have that little thin line there. Okay, so those are the parts of the bone. So let's look at our compact bone in detail versus our spongy bone in detail. Okay, so compact bone is arranged in a really specific sort of way, and it's arranged using something called the Haversian system, or osteons. And osteons are something called the functional unit of compact bone tissue. And a functional unit is just referring to something that is microscopic. It is a repeating unit. It's little microscopic structures that are repeated over and over and over again within a tissue. So lots and lots and lots of these, and they're doing the work of the tissue. And in the case of compact bone, the work of the tissue is just to essentially be strong, to protect the bone from breaking. It is to store calcium for later use if you need to get some calcium out of your bones for other things that you're using calcium for in the body. It's essentially a storage chamber for calcium, and that's what's happening in the compact bone, and that's what the osteons are doing. So what we have with compact bone, before we get into the actual osteon itself, is we need to think about how the matrix is, because bone is just a connective tissue, you know, and the, you know, like any other connective tissue, it's going to have cells, and it's going to have a matrix, and it's going to have extracellular protein fibers, which in the case of bone, it'll be mostly collagen in the bone matrix. But for compact bone, that matrix is really, really dense. For spongy bone, it's also really, really dense. But when we're thinking about the compact bone, we have the matrix organized into lamellae. And the word lamellae just means layers. And we're going to name those lamellae depending on how they're shaped, whether they're part of an osteon, so going in circles around an osteon, if they are you know, part of what used to be an osteon, or whether they're just kind of wrapping around a bunch of osteons or the outside layer of the bone. Now, within the lamellae, you're going to find the osteocytes, and the osteocytes are the mature bone cell. And remember, with both bone and cartilage, we have a really dense matrix, so our cells aren't just kind of floating around freely within that matrix. They are fixed, and they essentially have little holes or spaces, and those little spaces are called lacunae. And then you would have your little osteocyte, and it completely fills the space. But if you were to take the osteocyte away, you would just have that space. Now, let's fill that with an osteocyte. And our osteocytes, so they can communicate nutrients with each other, they're going to be connected with little canals, and these little canals are going to be going every which way. So we have like a lacunae with another osteocyte all over the place. So we'll have this real network of lacunae connected with these little canals, which are called canaliculi. Okay, now how those layers of matrix are arranged, so how those lamellae are arranged. They're arranged into osteons, mostly, so we have others, but let's look at the osteon first. If you look at the top of this, and this looks very much like what bone looks like on a microscopic slide. When you're looking at it, it's like a grayish black color, looks like, you know, tree trunks. You know, when somebody like cuts a tree and you've got just the stump of the tree, that's what this looks like. It looks like an osteon because it has these circles, these concentric circles. So the lamellae that are making these concentric circles are called concentric lamellae. And you'll find the osteocytes just kind of embedded within there, connected with little canaliculi. Okay. Now, within the very center of each osteon, there will be a canal that goes all the way through. And that's called the central canal or the Haversian canal. And so a blood vessel goes through there. So you'll find osteoprogenitors, osteoblasts, osteoclasts lining that. And that's to bring nutrients, fluids, carry away waste to the deeper layers of the lamellae, so inside the osteon. And you'll have lots and lots of osteons making up the bone. So I just put 3 here, but there would be tons and tons and tons of osteon all around each other. Now this is what an osteon would look like if you laid it on its side. So if you're looking at it from sideways instead of from above or below. So it's like a little cylinder, and you can see the top there, that would be like the stump of the tree. You can see the central canal or the Haversian canal with the blood vessel going through it. But what you can also see from this view are these little canals that go through the osteon in a sideways direction, and these are perforating canals. They contain blood vessels also, bringing nutrients and blood supply, taking away toxins and waste products and all that sort of stuff to the deeper areas of the osteon. And you'll also find osteoprogenitors, osteoblasts, osteoclasts in there. Now, let's go back to this picture. So just because we have these osteons sitting here, it doesn't mean that these are the osteons that you're going to have forever. You're not. You're going to be breaking down some osteons. So osteoclasts will be breaking down. Let's work on this osteon. We'll break it down. Where osteoblasts are busy building a new osteon, maybe somewhere over here. So we're going to constantly be recycling our osteons. We're not going to just keep the same old osteons. So we'll have kind of little remnants of old osteons, little fragments of what used to be an osteon, but it got broken down, like ruins. You know, you see a building and you see little bits of wall somewhere when the building has been, you know, let go or has been demolished. It's kind of the same idea. So there are those, and those are called interstitial lamellae. Interstitial always means something that's between other things. So it's really just layers of matrix that are between osteons. And then finally, our last type of lamellae are the circumferential lamellae, and that would be layers of matrix that go all around the outside. And you'll see that in lab when you get that far. We're not there yet, but you'll see you'll see on the model, you can see all of these structures that we just went over. Okay, now that's the hardest part of this. Spongy bone is pretty simple. Doesn't have any osteons. It completely fills up the marrow cavity, and the matrix is in the form of trabeculae. The word trabeculae just means like strands or filaments. That's the word I was looking for. Struts is another, like just things sticking out, strings almost. That's trabeculae. So you'll see trabeculae in some places in the body, like in your heart muscle, you'll have some trabeculae too. It would be muscles that are just kind of going in these strands. But in the case of spongy bone, it's bone matrix that's going in these strands. Now, within the spaces, because this looks really exactly like a sponge, and within the spaces that are formed by these trabeculae, you're going to find adipose tissue, and you'll find hematopoietic cells. Now this is a word, it's a big word, and if you take it apart, it'll tell you exactly what it says. The word poiesis, it means to make or to produce. So anytime you see a cell, there's a poietic cell. It is going to be a stem cell that is making some other kind of cell. And hema probably makes you think of something, right? Like hematology, things like that. That word is the root word for blood. So hematopoietic cells are stem cells for blood, which is right there. So these are the cells that make your red blood cells and your white blood cells, and they're found within the marrow cavity. And like we said before, spongy bone is very lightweight. Okay, so that is the general structure of bone. So that's it for this lecture.